Hello, this is the English language section of Free Radio Europe, a European voice in your home. Welcome from the building of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And given the dramatic developments on the international scene, I have the pleasure of introducing our special guest today, Arnaud Danjean, former head of the Defense Subcommittee of the European Parliament, for many years a civil servant in the French Defense Ministry, a French diplomat, a seasoned old hand of the Balkan Wars, and today my colleague in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Arnaud, we have a Chinese engagement in the Ukraine war. The role of China is something that keeps me awake at night because they are actually, in my view, the country that could not just mediate, but could actually influence President Putin to end this conflict. But their interests are pulling them in all kinds of ways, aren't they? They probably don't want Putin to fail miserably and fall. They don't want us to have a victory. They also probably don't want a precedent of a country not being able to recover what they see as a renegade province. But on the other hand, if they could bring about peace, their diplomatic stature would grow. Let's remember, President Teddy Roosevelt intervened in the Russo-Japan War in 1904 and thereby brought the United States onto the global scene. What's your view of this?
Well, first, let me thank you for your kind invitation. Indeed, we are good colleagues here in the Parliament, and I appreciate your work for a long time, even before you came to our group. But you know China much better than I do, I must say, and you have already produced some good papers here in this house. It's still unclear what they're heading for, and I think they don't have themselves consolidated a clear line of action, I would say. And it's a mixture of all the elements that you said. On the one hand, they speak, I would say, for what we call now the global south, because more or less they have become a kind of a leader of this alternative world, which is in competition with the liberal order that has prevailed for many decades, and they are openly challenging it now. They want to redesign the international scene to their advantage, of course. And in that regard, everything that can, I would say, put some problems within the Western world and the Western alliance will be seen as positive for them. So probably the first reaction is more to help Russia somehow, probably to help Russia to get out of this war in a quote-unquote decent way, which would make Russia still alive on the international scene, I would say. But that means also that they cannot go too far in being confrontational with the West. And I assume that they are trying to find a very, very narrow path to be indispensable, one way or another. And you see, just as we speak, we have learned, we don't have the details yet, that there is a big offensive, diplomatic offensive from China in the Middle East, trying to make an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Saudi Arabia was a long-standing ally or partner of the West in the Middle East. And if China has managed to do something diplomatically there, it shows that they are ready to engage also where we would expect them to be maybe more one-sided. So probably they are trying to design a line which is not quite clear right now. I would be very suspicious anyway, because once again, I think their first public opinion, so to say, is their domestic opinion.
And they've shaped it by using Russian narrative.
And the Russian narrative is very much alive in the Chinese official propaganda. And I mean, more than that, I think they are, I would say, portraying themselves for the global south as the leaders of another world, I would say, of a world which is reshaping not along the traditional liberal Western lines. So I don't see them being too too kind to us, I would say, to put it bluntly. But anyway, it shows also that it's difficult to do without. I mean, we have to take that into account, not to give too much credit to initiatives which are not so clear. Also, maybe not to be too alarming. We have read many things since the Blinken meeting in the margin of the G20 about this delivery of weapons issue. I don't see China committing too far to help Russia in this field.
They must fear our sanctions and our consumer boycotts.
I think it would not be probably the best way, the best card for them to play.
But Xi Jinping is capable of making a terrible mistake. The wolf warrior diplomacy was a terrible mistake. China used to be really popular around the world, and now he awoke mistrust of China with nothing to show for it, really.
Yes, I mean, this is a typical assertive policy of an authoritarian regime becoming more and more authoritarian. Indeed, there was some kind of rationality for many years about the way China was playing getting into the world organizations like the UN, investing in the world organization.
To take them over.
Yeah, and then you can see that it's all for one purpose, which is dominance and totally decomplexed dominance. So yes, indeed, I think there can be also some miscalculation from Chinese leadership in going too far in supporting, for example, Russia. But we're not there yet. I don't think we're there yet, and I think they are probably still trying to assess correctly what can be done.
I read the document that the Chinese call their peace plan, which is nothing of the sort. It's a sort of statement of principle skewed towards Russia. So what I also fear is that they will have a fake peace initiative, which would be a mistake in my view and a lost opportunity, so as to be able to say, we tried, but since it doesn't work, the West, Ukraine is intransigent, therefore we are justified in delivering weapons to Russia.
That could be one scenario. And this kind of a fake peace plan, we have a long experience of it. You were recalling the Balkan Wars. I remember Russia, every time their friends in the region were in difficult position, they would come up with so-called peace plan. And then if you refuse the peace plan, you are the bad guy in the room. And then it's a pretext to escalate and to take side more explicitly. So yes, indeed, that could happen. We'll see. Even though, sorry to say that, and I think China is a very important country, of course, but I don't think it is the key issue right now. And I think the key issue right now is really on the battlefield. And whatever comes from China in terms of diplomatic initiatives, I don't think it can have a big influence on what's going on and on what will go on for many weeks, I fear many months even, and which is in the battlefield.
How is this war being perceived in France?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of a paradox of the French position seen from outside. The outside perception is that France is still, you know, a bit cautious in supporting Ukraine, cautious on denouncing Russia, and like Macron was, you know, trying to find a way to balance and so on. Well, indeed,
he was trying to play the peacemaker in his election campaign, which you can forgive him for.
It went a bit beyond the election campaign. But anyway, I think if you go to the population, and we could have seen that from the very beginning of the war, there was a huge wave of solidarity, spontaneously. I'm living in a rural area, not very sensitive to foreign policy issues, I would say. People would spontaneously gather in support for Ukraine, bring food. There were not even enough storage to find places. A lot of people would volunteer to drive to Ukraine. Many of them did that. We welcome many refugees, even though we are not in a very easy place to come. So the solidarity is big and still is. And when you have opinion polls in France, an overwhelming majority is seeing clearly what's going on and in supporting Ukraine. The thing is, we have many vocal people, especially with the social networks phenomena, vocal people, quite influential people who would side with Russia or be a bit critical towards the West. Because
Marine Le Pen would love to be the Chamberlain of this war, huh?
Yeah, actually, but that's interesting because a few weeks ago you had even people from the Rassemblement National, who are obviously pro-Russian, saying that what is going on in Ukraine shows that these Ukrainians are fighting for sovereignty and nation, which are values from the extreme right, so to say, and that we should consider also some kind of legitimacy in this fight. So, yes, indeed, I think these people have understood, even the most pro-Russian people, I would say, have understood that the public opinion is clearly...
And that Ukraine is a real nation.
Yeah, and that was a key point, especially in my political family, in our political family, the right-wing family, the Gaullist family in France. A lot of people were a bit reluctant at first to engage very clearly. But the key factor was seeing how the Ukrainian nation, that they would deny the very existence at some point, was indeed existing, resisting for values which are our values.
Ready to die and to kill.
Real fighters, brave fighters, but not only fighters on the front line. The way the whole Ukrainian society has shown immense resilience is an example that has struck people's mind in France. One of my good friends is the mayor of Cannes, city of Cannes, David Lisnard, is, I hope, a promising talent in our family. The very first day of the war, he went to Lviv and make a partnership between Lviv and Kiev. And today, as we speak, the mayor of Lviv is in Cannes, and David went many times there. And for me, it was the show that, whatever were the position before, once it started, things were clear. And I think the general mood in France is this one. Solidarity is really impressive. Also, I must say that for many years with the COVID pandemic and so on, we had a lot of debate in France, like everywhere in Europe, about resilience, this magic word which was translated everywhere and which was becoming the core value of our societies, but nobody really knew what it meant. Ukraine is showing us what it means, because it's, once again, not only a military war. It's a mobilization of the whole nation to make the train system working, which is absolutely incredible. And it's a test of social system. A top-down system on the Russian side, a bottom-up system. Democracy is still vibrant. Anti-corruption things are going on. I mean, so it goes beyond the war itself, I would say. And I think the French public opinion is sensitive to that.
The French experience is interesting intellectually for me, because I have taken the liberty of comparing French attitudes towards the war in Indochina, but in particular in Algeria, to the Russian experience. Namely, you have something that you believe is part of the patrie, and which is deciding to be separate. And it takes time for the elites to get used to the idea that those people don't want to be with us. And it takes time, doesn't it? Yes, indeed. I'm not at ease with this topic since it's not comfortable. It's not comfortable, but it's still, I mean, for me, it's quite a foreign experience, because I was not born. I was born a long time after the Algerian war was over. None of my family is coming from this place. So for me, independence of Algeria was part of France. But it was part of France. Was it? It was part of France. But still, the comparison goes to a certain extent, because still there was. We were neighbors, but the Mediterranean was in between. So, the closeness was not that close in terms of geographical terms, I would say. In terms of mixture of population as well, there was quite separate societies at the time, with a minority, European minority, and a huge, overwhelming... And yet, the colonial war took 8 years. Yep. Yeah. No, it's always difficult to, once it starts and it becomes existential for some people, and not only ideologically, because you can think that it's ideological for some Kremlin people. You have to admit that for some people it's existential, where they want to live, which kind of territories. So, yes, it's always... For the elite in the metropolis, nobody wants to be blamed for losing the former colony. Huh? Of course. And I think everywhere you have this
disputed territories, be it colonial past or not so colonial. But anyway, when you have two nations, one land, everywhere in the world, when we have this kind of conflict, we show how difficult it is. The solutions may even sometimes be clear, even territorially speaking, but mentally, ideologically speaking, having a leadership which is ready to, give up something or to make a compromise on such things that are seen like existential, it makes things very difficult. And we have a lot of conflicts which are...
France in Indochina, 8 years. France in Algeria, 8 years. The Portuguese in Angola, 13 years. The British in North America, 7 years, I think. The Spaniards in Latin America, decades. The British in Ireland, decades.
Yeah, and some of these conflicts are not over yet. And you could think about India, Pakistan, because it's not only colonial things. I think it's, once again, disputed territories. And it makes things different. Look at Serbia, Kosovo. I think sometimes I think about another war, which is Second World War, of course, which comes to mind very clearly. And when you think that 18 years, which is already a long time, but 18 years after the war, De Gaulle and Adenauer were ready and to make things together and to put that chapter behind. And we are more than, 23, 25 years after the wars in the Balkans, and nothing has really changed, in terms of mindset. So it shows that we are there for long haul, I think, unfortunately.
Strasbourg is a very good place in which to discuss such matters, because, of course, it was a disputed city for many centuries.
It was, yeah.
It started as Argentorum. It has a German name today, but it's part of France, and it changed hands. And yet, after 2,000 years of wars, the border between the Latin world and the German world is where it was. And the idea of European unity is to stop fighting over territory, right?
Yep.
But that also meant that the European Union has, in its DNA, an aversion to conflict.
Indeed, yeah.
We have managed to make war unthinkable within Europe, where I think some of our elites went wrong, was to think that therefore it's unthinkable to have conflict on the European periphery.
Absolutely. But it was already the case in the 90s, the war in the Balkans, which was a terrible failure. And I remember that at the time, 1991, when it started, there was a European Council meeting, and you had one of the foreign minister of one of the old nation of Europe saying...
the hour of Europe has struck.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've promised ourselves an intervention force of what, 50,000?
Yeah. And
where is it?
Yeah, it went up to 60,000, I think, at some point. These famous headline goals that we had 25 years ago, almost. Yes, indeed, I think, and quite interestingly, in all European texts and documents, we call crisis management. We avoid the word war, conflict. This is something else because it was all about conflict prevention, mediation, crisis management to the
gendarmerie forces, election supervision.
Now we have to change the whole paradigm.
Right, but what we're actually discussing is actually something very modest. A unit of 5,000.
Intervention, rapid
and really just an enhancement of the battle groups, which have proven to be a failure.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that we can make it still. I'm not sure that we can make it in the framework of the European Union. And this is probably one of the lessons of what's going on now. It's that NATO, of course, is far from being brain dead. NATO is there. And I think more than ever, we're talking about a European pillar within NATO. I think everything which is meant to be developed in an autonomous way in Europe, even though I was long advocating for that, and I think there is still strategic logics behind that. We have to be also realistic. Creating something on our own will prove still difficult.
That's one realism, which I accept. But there is the other realism, which is that in this conflict in Ukraine, we as Europe have been incredibly lucky. If it wasn't Joe Biden in the White House, if it wasn't for the, let's say, less than a successful withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States might have said, Ukraine is not an ally, you, Europe, deal with it. And then we would have been completely helpless.
That's why I think there is still logic behind European autonomy, so to say. I know that the word is controversial, and I understand why, especially in Eastern Europe. I can understand the reserves towards the French ambition of an autonomous defense Europe, but still, I think it's still valid strategically if we look a bit beyond, even if we look further down, because if we had a Trump in power, if we had a reluctant US administration, what would have happened then? We would...
Or if the United States is engaged in a conflict with China and is physically incapable of helping us.
So that's why we must deliver on this. But my point is that I have long hoped that we could deliver on our own. I think today the first deliveries in this regard, when it comes to combat unit, I would say, that will be mainly dealt within NATO. I am still a bit reserved about the ability of the EU as such, also because we have different status within EU, you know. We have less and less neutral countries, and I'm quite happy that Finland and Sweden will join NATO, and it will help in terms of interoperability. But still, we still have countries, Ireland, Austria, Cyprus, which have a different status. So it's quite difficult to run these things at 27. We have also to take into account a kind of a comeback of the UK. And I think it's a good sign. We need the UK. When we talk about...
plug them in some fashion,
yes,
in the security sphere.
So that's why if you ask me, my priorities today will be the plug with the UK, replug with the UK, dealing with within NATO to make European countries stronger within NATO, maybe more than developing something on our own. You would have asked me 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, I would have said something maybe differently, because I really thought that the European ambition was there. And today, let's face the reality.
You know, I despair. If the war in Ukraine is not making Europeans serious about their own self-defense, nothing else will.
Yeah, I think it will make them more serious. And what we have seen for the last year was quite impressive in a way, because unity of Europeans, also quick deliveries of weapons, whatever we say.
10 packages of sanctions.
Packages of sanctions. So I think, and it's, the resilience is okay. So far, so good, I would say. And I hope it
my
will
latest
last.
figure are that the EU and its member states have pledged or spent already 67 billion euros, which compares rather well with America's 70 billion, more or less.
Absolutely. If you put all together, I think we are more or less on the same footage.
But will it last?
But will it last? That's a big question. And second question remains...
And this is what Putin must be counting on.
Of course. And I think much more than the military strengths, because Russia has military strengths, and we should not neglect that. Sometimes we are too enthusiastic about the fact that they will be defeated on the ground militarily. I would not bet on that. But I think the main asset, so to say, on which Putin is probably trying to play, like any authoritarian regime confronted with the military strengths, is trying to divide democracies, because we are weaker in a sense. And he will try to play our public opinion, he will try to play our business community, he will try to play some military people also, and you will...
But he also fundamentally misunderstands the psychology of democracies. How?
Like all the dictators at some point. I remember Milosevic, when he attacked Kosovo, and when NATO strike again, he would probably bet
we are not as degenerate as they think.
Yeah, but I think all the dictators at some point, when they were confronted with the military strengths of the West, at some point they thought, well, these democracies are too weak, the public opinion will rally, there will be divisions among themselves, and it did not happen, and I hope it will not happen. And I don't think it will happen this time, because I think most of the European leaders and people have understood that it's an existential war. And Putin made it existential, by the way, because even though if we would have liked to keep it kind of a isolated conflict and limited conflict in a portion of European territory, Ukraine, I think the way Putin has put a lot of values in that.
And he broke our taboos, that you shall not change borders by force, that you shall not use the pretext of protecting your compatriots as a pretext for annexation.
A lot of principles were put in this war, in a negative way, of course, breaking principles and rules, also the crimes that were committed. And so not only it did alienate totally the Ukrainian population, of course, but also the Western world and the Europeans as a whole, because they say, well, I mean, there is no excuse for that. And so it's existential, because you put so much in it.
And the trouble, as I see it, is that we can't really make peace with him. Because this is a guy who lies in your face. These are not my men in Crimea. I'm not intending to invade Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia actually have a peace treaty in which they've pledged to respect each other's borders. So how can you make a new treaty with a man who, well, I didn't respect that treaty, but trust me, I'll respect the next one?
Well, the thing is, usually the only reliable peace can be achieved through a clear-cut end of a war, which is victory and defeat. That's going to prove difficult. I don't have the answer. Of course, you have the whole, and we are politicians, so we have to be careful about what we say, because I think what we have to say now is Ukraine must prevail, and Ukraine must win this war. Then, if we were in a different position as think tankers, then we could argue that what victory means, what will happen, where do we put the line for a victory or not, and so that's going to prove difficult. That's going to prove difficult, but a peace, a lasting peace, can be achieved only with clear results, military results. That's what we did not assume in the Balkans, for example. In Bosnia, we did not want to win, you know, to some extent. So we ended up with this kind of compromise, which 25 years after is still, you know, problematic. And unfortunately, everywhere where you have this kind of no solution, problems resurface quite regularly.
My thesis is that this war will only end when Russia decides that it was a mistake to launch it. And for Russia to decide that, they would need to have either some mass defections and mutinies, or there has to be a Ukrainian victory spectacular enough for people in Russia to decide Putin has made a mistake and he needs to go.
Indeed, I share your view. I share your view. It's probably not a question of a total defeat, total victory, but it's something spectacular enough that, then it rings the bell in Russia and said, okay, enough is enough.
Because all these colonial wars were ended by different people than started them.
Most of the time, the leadership who waged the war, this kind of war, is not the one who is making the peace. And indeed, but that's a big question mark. And that remains the biggest question mark. And no one has the answer. Would any spectacular offensive by the Ukrainians militarily lead to something, a move in Moscow? We can hope so. But we can hope, but we cannot bet on that.
Quite. And in the meantime, let's work together to beef up Europe's defense.
The last word is what I wanted to say is, indeed, I think the Europeans are meeting the expectations. I think they are now again serious when they talk about defense. That's a good point about the whole thing. We are serious when talking about defense. But I still have my doubt about can we sustain the effort to such an extent that indeed, if there would be a bad surprise from our American allies, we would be able to do something on our own. I still have my doubt, unfortunately. I wish we could, but I'm not sure. That will be...
And it takes a decade to create something
It takes
serious.
a decade. It takes a decade. So we're only at the starting point, so to say.
Arnaud Danjean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Radek.
This has been the English language section of Free Radio Europe, a European voice in your home. If you've liked it, please share and subscribe my channel. Thank you very much from the seat of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Thank you and goodbye.